Hello, guys. David Vos here. What a beautiful day. It's just such a beautiful day. It's still warm and humid, but it looks like it's about to rain. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, I'm going to go through some very intricate details about our history here in America. Not so much the history in that sense, but the background, what was really going on. Because I want to know what's really going on right now. Who's running the show and what are they doing? I believe they're orchestrating the collapse of society. I believe this is a classroom and this is the final exam. And I believe that they're doing it on purpose. I don't necessarily believe that the people in charge are all saints anymore. I think there's a great number of them that have fallen. And there might be some that know the truth and just sit back and there's nothing they can do because they're not in power. But there is a system. There's a Hollywood. There's a script, and there is a plan. And when we see all these what we call red flags, or we see things like transgenderism and pandemics, and we wonder what's going on. I really do believe that it is a MK Ultra mind control experiment, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. And so what I want to do is go back to the early days when they were making the Constitution with Abraham Lincoln and Civil War, Joseph Smith, and organizations and groups, and take a little look at what they were doing and try to piece a few things together because we got to make sense of this. Now, I've studied all of this history probably as well as anyone else, and I know that there were things going on that most people have no clue. I know what was going on with Benjamin Franklin and the Nine Sisters in France and the Illuminati and the Voltaire and the secrets and the goings-ons and the plot. And I can give you some background information as to what the motives were with some of these individuals. So I want to start off literally talking about a man that we've talked about before named Abraham Jonas. He was an Orthodox Jew, and he was the Grand Master in Illinois. He was the one who made Joseph Smith the Grand Master, knowing that Joseph Smith was a prophet or claimed to be. And this seems to fit entirely and completely right in with Sinclair and the ceremonies and the Delphi of the Brotherhood and the Francis Bacon idea. This is New America, New Jerusalem, and they were building the kingdom of deity on earth. So who was Abraham Jonas, and who was the individuals that Joseph Smith was hobnobbing around with? And were these the same individuals hobnobbing with President Lincoln in Washington? Yes. So I don't believe that our history in our age was just accidental, grassroots. I believe it was orchestrated in every detail. Somebody thought they were orchestrating it. Somewhere in the world, there has been some individuals with a plan. It appears that they allowed other plans that weren't good. And then they also had good plans. And they had a way that you could choose. I mean, even with music, you notice there's music that's bad. I just found this out yesterday that Dolly Parton died. I didn't know that. And I actually didn't realize until yesterday just how wonderful a woman that lady was. She was beautiful. She was clever. She was smart. She was funny. And, dadgummit, she had some of the best songs there ever was. And I didn't even really realize it. All I could remember was 925, and I didn't like that song. But she had a lot of really, really important songs that I've been hearing because people are talking about her because she just passed away. But after really sitting there and looking at this woman, now that she's passed, and thinking about her career and all that she's done, I've known for a long time that she's one of the biggest all-time sellers, especially as far as country goes. She may be the number one bestseller of all time. Her and Johnny Cash, and and then later people down the road came along like Garth Brooks and stuff. But Dolly Parton has made enough money, as much money I would say, as some of these top individuals like the Beatles and Michael Jackson and stuff. She was huge in the business. And as I'm listening to some of her old songs and looking at her, I begin to realize that they orchestrated this. Now, I don't know that they created her out of nothing. She was a singer. She came on the stage. They saw her. They made her a star. They financed her rise. And I really believe they used her to be that side of the coin. She was that friendly, happy person who sang good songs, was a good role model. They didn't finance just bad people. Even Elvis wasn't the bad guy, although he was Jewish, by the way. But there were lots of people that influenced us. Even people like Johnny Cash that had gone to jail, but served as a role model to say, stay out of jail. Or Waylon and Willie and Merle Haggard, who was like, oh, yeah, don't go to jail like me. So they were role models. There were good things. They sang songs that might have been, songs with a little brutal honesty and a little bit of darkness, like Merle Haggard, songs like, I turned 21 in prison doing life without parole. No one could steer me right, but Mama tried, Mama tried, Mama tried to raise me better, but her pleading I denied. That leaves only me to blame, 'cause Mama tried. So I think that our influencers were part of a group of knowers, but how these individuals were knowers and what all the particulars are regarding this knowing is something that we're going to have to delve into to get a more accurate understanding. I want to talk about Abraham Jonas to start with, who was the guy that initiated Joseph Smith into the Masonic degrees. And Abraham Jonas, as we go and look at this, he must have known something. He initiated Joseph Smith as the Grand Master in a day. He knew Smith was acting as a prophet already. He was already acting as a prophet at this time. In fact, this is just before he died. That he was building temples. Did Abraham Jonas have or teach these Smith ideas to him? Was he a student of the Rosicrucian group or a branch? Was he from a Yorkite group that was related to the Rosicrucians? Did Rosicrucians reside in York? Was there a chain or a line or priesthood from Francis Bacon to Jonas or Abraham Jonas? Or did Abraham Jonas just recognize Joseph Smith's prophetic gift and say, yeah, I think you should be the Grand Master? Well, Abraham Jonas didn't teach his own ideas to Smith. He didn't recognize him as a prophet necessarily. We don't know that. I mean, I suppose you could say that if he knew that he was acting as a prophet and he made him a Grand Master on sight, he must have approved of something. But their relationship was also political and fraternal, because Jonas was a prominent Jewish pioneer, lawyer, and politician who served as the first Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Illinois. And he lived 35 miles from Joseph Smith. When he initiated Joseph Smith as a Master Mason at sight in March of 1842, and Joseph Smith died in 1844, it was not a necessarily, you could say, it might not be a spiritual endorsement, but maybe rather it was a pragmatic alliance. Maybe Joseph Smith wanted political protection. And remember, Abraham Jonas was very high up, was orchestrating. He was called the kingmaker. He was, helping Abraham Lincoln become president. He was fighting hard against the slavery group. These were abolitionists, people who were trying to save mankind. So, if Joseph Smith might have wanted political protection as well, and a network of loyal allies for the saints, while Jonas, who was ambitious and he was a Whig politician, wanted the immense voting bloc of the thousands of saints living in Nauvoo. It may have been simply pragmatic. It might not have been because he approved, or they sat around talking in private circles and crafted the whole thing out. We don't know, but maybe they did. Jonas was within the mainstream American Freemasonry. At that time, it was the York Rite, a system for the Blue Lodges, the first 3 degrees of the entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. So, Jonas was not a student, as far as we know, of a member of the Rosicrucian occult group. Rosicrucianism and esoteric mystical movements would focus on spiritual alchemy and secret wisdom, and might be historically separate from the mainstream American Freemasonry. I mean, because all we ever hear is that they were political ideologists. Nobody talked a whole lot about spiritual things. Yeah, there were some, Fillmore and, there were spiritual rhythms and books that were written and passed around, but openly and politically, they didn't talk about it. I think average person in America at that time wouldn't even have understood Masonry. They were all Protestants, and somehow their churches were teaching them to stay away from it because they were going on some other group that was in America for a different political reason. I don't know if they meshed or worked together, but Jonas was an Orthodox Jew, and he was, I guess, focusing on civic duty, local commerce, and expanding Freemasonry as a fraternal moral institution to restore its public reputation. But he didn't pass hidden mystical ideas or esoteric teachings on to Joseph Smith, as far as we are told. And the fact that they were called the York Rite is just an historical nod to the city of York, England, where there were early Masonic legends claiming the first General Assembly of the Masons were held under King Athelstan. However, York was not the historical capital or the residence of the Rosicrucians. The Rosicrucian movement primarily originated in Germany. Now, this is very crucial. The Bavarian Illuminati also originated in Germany, in Bavaria, and they also set up their thing in 1776 in Germany, the Illuminati. While at the same time, 1776, they were ratifying, the Bill of Rights and stuff here in America and giving us a constitution. So the Rosicrucian movement originated in Germany in the early 17th century with the publication of the Rosicrucian Manifestos. And the Rosicrucian ideas eventually influenced some higher degree of European Freemasons, such as the Knight of the Rosy Cross degree in the Scottish Rite. This developed later on in France and Scotland, not York. So it wouldn't, if Jonas was mainly from the York Rite and was a Orthodox Jew. He might not have known anything about the Rosicrucians, who didn't like the other side, maybe Kabbalist individuals that were into esoteric, but more of the politics and York and all of that. So you had, I would say, two groups in Europe back in the early days, 1700s. You had what became the Jacob Frank evil group that was kind of adopted by the Illuminati to do evil, to bring out the good, that you had to sin to become righteous, that you had to manipulate society and give them tests and offer them evil so that they could become strong and resist it. Or, it was manipulation of society. And that's even painting it with a broad stroke of maybe they had a good or a sincere heart, that they were doing it for good reasons. You can see this happening with Aleister Crowley and Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard and the rest, and Anton LaVey, because they were openly acting like they were demonic and dressing up like demons and taking drugs and falling through the cracks and claiming they wanted to be the beast or manifest the beast nature or orchestrate the harlot horror of Revelation for the latter days. It was always about this. John Dee earlier was into this dark seance and trying to bring up the beast out of the bottomless pit. Why were they doing it? Because they wanted and they loved the beast, they loved the devil, or were they somehow in their mind sacrificing themselves, like Judas, who went out and hung himself, in order to quicken, right? Do what thou must do it quickly. Maybe they weren't trying to quickly, reveal the man of sin, that the Christ might be seen by every eye. So that would have been giving them the benefit of the doubt that somehow they were doing evil but thought they were doing good. The Rosicrucians didn't agree with that. Francis Bacon distanced himself from John Dee. They were contemporaries. They didn't like each other. And the Rosicrucians were obviously good, and certainly wherever they could get a chance, in a painting or in music or in the Bible, King James, or everything they're writing in code, they showed Mary, pictures of Mary, the alabaster box with oil, the skull and bones of John, to show their lineage back to the one who was beheaded, John, which indicated that they believed in the Bible very strongly. Francis Bacon wrote the New Atlantis, financed colonist ship voyages to discover America, the New Atlantis, to establish it. Sinclair did the ceremony to make the Capitolium based on the old geometry, of these funerals and cemeteries and processions and ancient temple rites. Somebody knew something. And you have to ask yourself, is the good side who hated the bad side, was it orchestrated? Or did they hate each other? Or were they working like communist capitalists, Democrat, secretly, of a Hegelian dialectic? This is what I'm trying to understand. Because from a biblical standpoint, well, we'll get to that. Because from a biblical standpoint, it does make sense. But you have to fully understand history to understand all this evil. So, we don't have an historical line or a chain or a succession of priesthood lineages that connects Sir Francis Bacon to Abraham Jonas. We just don't have any, as far as I know, there's no evidence. But there are some alternative historians and literary theorists that speculate that Francis Bacon was a hidden leader of the Rosicrucians and secretly helped shape early speculative Freemasonry. But this is a matter of some kind of lore, occult lore, rather than documented history. We don't know for sure. Abraham Jonas's authority didn't come from an esoteric priesthood line, as far as we know, but from a purely institutional one. He was elected the Grand Master by a convention of Illinois lodges. His power was administrative, which gave him the traditional right to fast-track candidates through the fraternity's degrees. Well, at least if we don't learn anything else today, we're going to learn that these fraternities, the Masons, run the political and the economic and everything else in the country. And none of these people are being voted in by us. They're presented and everything's being orchestrated. But there were good people doing some of the orchestrating. But in modern society, it seems like the good people, maybe they were murdered. Joseph Smith was murdered. Abraham Jonas died. Lincoln was murdered. Maybe they all died or was martyred, just like the apostles, right? And that's how it always works. And then the bad guys take over for a while in order to manifest sin, in order there's to be a reset. And I don't know, but Abraham Jonas had a close relationship with Abraham Lincoln. And he got backlash for backing Joseph Smith from non-Mormon lodges because he made Joseph Smith a Mason so quickly. I know in the 1500s and the 1600s, like Bacon, Newton, Beethoven, Pisani, the painter, Teniers, or Michelangelo, they knew some kind of secret doctrine about Mary. It's in the paintings, music. It's in the book, The New Atlantis. And Joseph Smith seemed to have some knowledge of all of this. I know it is told that he was studying or learning from some old Jew or some old rabbi. He spoke of this old Jew in the Follett Discourse. It's a famous speech that Joseph Smith gave before he died, the Follett Discourse. And they taught him, supposedly, he said, about Hebrew translations in Genesis chapter 1. So, was that old Jew that taught him that Abraham Jonas, the Orthodox Jew? Jonas only lived 35 miles away. Surely they were friends. They must have sat around a table. They were in the same lodge probably for a while if he was the one who initiated him. And they must have sat around talking about these secrets and these combinations and goings-ons. Well, the timeline identifies a little bit of a different story there. The old Jew that Joseph Smith referenced wasn't probably Abraham Jonas. Oh, it could have been. And in some sense, he spoke to more than one, but he wasn't necessarily a traditional scholar of ancient Hebrew texts. But if you look at the records at that time, it points to a completely different person who lived just blocks away from Joseph Smith, who actually was an old rabbi. His name was Alexander Niebuhr. And in that famous Ken Follett Discourse in April of 1844, by the way, this is so coincidental, or it's just fate or destiny. But Joseph Smith died right after this. And this discourse that Joseph Smith gave in 1844 in April, just before he was assassinated, was historical. I personally believe that when history looks back, there will be three great historical moments. And regardless of whether we like it or not, Moses's hike up the mountain, coming back down with the laws in his hand, has got to be one of them, because the entire world was based on it. And of course, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is the new covenant, and everything's been based on that now. But what Joseph Smith said is so revolutionary. No one had done what he did in those 2,000 years after Jesus. Joseph Smith stood up and said things that most Christians, if they heard it, would just turn around and say, well, the guy's evil then. Like, what? He's not a Christian? Because he taught Elohim was plural, that Jesus was the son of his Father, and that we're a family, and that the divine being dwells in everyone, and that there was a plan, and that deity once was as we are now, and that we will be as deity is now, one day. And this is a profound teaching. And if it's false, it's the most diabolical evil that ever existed or was presented to mankind. But if it's the truth, then I guess, like Jesus said, if I cast out devils by means of Beelzebub, then, the devil's fighting his own people and his kingdom cannot stand. But if I cast out the devils by means of the true deity, then the kingdom is among you, and it's here, and you should recognize it. So I recognize Joseph Smith as a true prophet. And if you look at what he said, I shall comment. This is part of his discourse. He said, I shall comment on the very first Hebrew words in the Bible, Beroshit. He says, an old Jew without any authority added the word bath. He thought it too bad to begin to talk about the head. And then he goes on to explain that in the beginning doesn't mean in the beginning of time, but in the chief. The chief one of the deities created the heavens. So this is extraordinary. And it wasn't, he didn't invent it. It was an old Jewish belief. So Joseph's private tutor and close friend during this exact window of time was Alexander Nabar. Nabar was born in Prussia, raised in a high-class Jewish home where he was educated to become a rabbi. He later chose to study dentistry instead. To me, that sounds like he chose a lucrative position. And a lot of them did. And, and nowadays, I think there are more people that understand, even though they don't do it, they understand that if you choose a financial lucrative position, you're following money and power and not goodness and morality and helping the world. I mean, there are lawyers that become lawyers that say they want to help people, but then they go out and make millions. So I don't know how much they're helping. But this man was a Jewish rabbi who was going to be a rabbi, but then chose to be a dentist. Then he converted to Christianity. Why? Because he wanted more, that suited his professional career more. It would have been easier to say I'm a Christian and not be, looked down upon if he was a rabbi or something. That doesn't, I don't know. And on the other hand, he may have literally converted to Christianity because he believed in Christ. I'm not judging him. I'm only looking at this and we're trying to understand. But he became the first Jewish convert to join the group with Joseph Smith. He actually liked what Joseph Smith was saying, an Orthodox rabbi, and he became a follower of Joseph Smith, which I find very odd. Joseph Smith was a very young man when he started all this talk, about 15, when he was telling everybody he saw an angel and he got the plates and he finally translated. He was like early, young man, like 20, and these grown men, like Oliver Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon and all, important individuals. Like Rigdon was a very influential person in the Alexander Campbell movement. And, so these guys were following Joseph. Why? Because he was a clever young man? Was he sent to school? Was he groomed? Who were all these people? This is something I have to really think about. But he moved to Nauvoo, this Nabar, in 1841. And just a month later, he decides to follow Joseph Smith. Come on, a respected rabbi follows this young man who got this revelation. What's going on? Were they orchestrated? Was he an orchestrator? Or was he a follower? See, he lived just blocks away from Joseph Smith, I guess on purpose. He wanted to be near the prophet. And he had journals he kept, and you can look at his entries in the journal. And he explicitly noted that in the months leading up to the King Follett sermon, Joseph Smith's journal entries specifically note that the months that led up to the King Follett sermon, Joseph Smith spent his days, quote, in his journal, at home to recite German and Hebrew with Brother Naibar, the Jew. So this is where our idea of a secret doctrine or esoteric connection gets incredibly interesting from some kind of a historical perspective. Alexander Naibar didn't just teach Joseph standard Hebrew vocabulary. He was deeply well read in the Kabbalah, mystical Jewish philosophy. In 1843, Naibar published an article in the church's Times and Seasons newspaper where he directly quoted from the Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalistic mysticism. So the historians say that Joseph Smith's unique translation of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 in the King Follett sermon, which interpreted the head one of the deities brought forth the deities, rather than in beginning God created the heavens and the earth, closely mirrors Kabbalistic interpretations of the creation found in the Zohar, which transforms Elohim from a single creator into a plural emanation, and Naibar is widely believed to be a conduit for those esoteric concepts. So, when we talk about Sir Francis Bacon, who had this utopian text, the New Atlantis, we talk about Isaac Newton, Beethoven, and the Renaissance artists like Michelangelo, keeping secret doctrines. That aligns with what historians call the Western esoteric tradition. These figures were heavily influenced by Hermeticism, Christian Kabbalah, early Rosicrucian ideas, all of which focus on the idea that the divine ancient knowledge had been lost to the mainstream world and was hidden in the symbols, art, and the sacred geometry that only the scholars were looking into. Joseph Smith absolutely tapped into that cultural current through his exposure to Freemasonry via Abraham Jonas and the Nauvoo Lodge, his deep dive into Hebrew mysticism via Alexander Naibar, and his own revelations. And Joseph Smith was intentionally trying to restore what he viewed as the ultimate original secret doctrine, the ancient patriarchal priesthood, temple mysteries, and the concept of human deification or exaltation. So while Abraham Jonas provided the legal, political, institutional Masonic keys, it was Alexander Naibar who sat in Joseph's parlor, opening up all the books of the Jewish mysticism and discussing the deeper hidden meanings of the Hebrew creation text. But Alexander Naibar was not a member of the formalized member of modern esoteric schools like the Rosicrucian Lodge or any other specialized occult society, but his upbringing and education did place him directly inside the world's most intense historical pipeline of Jewish mysticism that you could find. Because of his unique background, Naibar carried a line of transmission, you might say, directly from the heart of European esoteric movement straight into Joseph Smith's parlor there in Nauvoo just before the King Follett discourse. There are other historians who study the intersection of Joseph Smith and Kabbalah, and they point to Naibar's early life geography to explain how he acquired this esoteric knowledge. He was a Polish-German individual from the borderlands up there in Europe. His father was Nathan Naibar, who was an educated Polish Jew who served as a surgeon and a linguist for Napoleon. So this wasn't just somebody. This man, Naibar's dad, was the surgeon and the linguist for Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, I just cannot say all of this could be coincidence. That a man who was of Polish Jewish descent, whose father was the physician linguist for Napoleon Bonaparte, would then fly over to, that was 1800, right? So then a few years later, his son goes to America and becomes the teacher of Joseph Smith the prophet. So the Jewish communities of Poland and Western Germany were heavily influenced by the Hasidic Jews and remnants of the Sabbatinianism and Frankism. And I've talked about Frankism before. We don't like Frankism here. His name was Jacob Frank. This is what got going with the Illuminati and financed by the Rothschilds. These were two highly esoteric traditions, radical mystical movements that broke away from mainstream Judaism. They were Jewish, but they were radical movements in Judaism. And these groups focused heavily on secret combinations of Hebrew letters, the spiritual feminine, the Shekinah, and the idea that the Messiah would overturn traditional laws and bring in a restoration of all things. So Alexander Nybar was rigorously educated in traditional Jewish law. He was trying to become a rabbi at a very young age. If a student undertook serious rabbinical studies in that region during the early 19th century, to avoid the Zohar, the primary text of the Kabbalah, was virtually impossible. And at the age of 17, Nybar pivoted. He changed his path. He moved to the University of Berlin to study surgical dentistry. At that time, Berlin was the absolute epicenter of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, where traditional religious texts were being weighed and paired with Western philosophy and Hermetic thought. We know that Nybar brought this mystical line of thought with him because of the specific books he owned and the books he quoted from in Nauvoo. There is an historian named Lance S. Owens who documented that Nybar possessed a working collection of rare Kabbalistic literature. He had in his possession the Zohar, which is the core text of the Jewish mysticism. He had the Emek HaMelech, or the Valley of the King, which is a very intricate, dense text, 1648 text, detailing Kabbalistic concepts of the shattering of the vessels and the cosmic restoration of the divine spark. See, that's very key. Shattering the vessels, the outer vessel, to get and restore the divine spark. This is probably where even Frankism came from. And number 3, the Menorah HaMahar, or the candlestick of light, the menorah. So when Nybar sat down and was tutoring Joseph Smith in Hebrew and German starting in 1841, he wasn't just teaching him vocabulary or some silly thing. He was opening up these books and sharing their deeper mystical commentaries in the Hebrew language. So then you've got another guy in Joseph Smith's life that knew academic Hebrew and so forth. Joshua Sexius. So before Nybar, Joseph Smith hired Joshua Sexius in Kirtland, Ohio, 1836. This is about 5 years before this. He hired him to teach him Hebrew. Sexius was the son of Gershom Mendes Sexius, a prominent New York rabbi. While Sexius taught Joseph academic Hebrew grammar, that is what primed Joseph's obsession with looking beneath the English text of the Bible to find some hidden meanings. So, early in Joseph Smith's life in New York, there was a local physician and occultist named Luman Walters. He operated in the same neighborhood. Walters was rumored to have traveled to Europe to study mesmerism. You see, hypnotism, mesmerism is a very dark occultic thing. I don't agree with that. He studied alchemy, which I don't know that that's dark, but it's interesting, and clairvoyance. Now, of course, modern Protestants would say all that's evil. They didn't believe that this was evil. Hermeticism had these things operating in it. And there were people that did the bad things, the seances and all of that. And then there were those who, like Nostradamus, remember Nostradamus, the dame, was a man from France in the Languedoc, where the Knights of St. John were from. His esoteric expertise wasn't really Kabbalah, but it was the esoteric Knights of St. John, the Catharism. And this was the chain of esoteric truth that was brought to the Rosicrucians. They didn't really like John Dee and the Kabbalah. They distanced themselves from that. But this Lumen Walters, who was in that same neighborhood, did study all of this, and he was teaching Joseph Smith. Coincidental, or just he had to find a Jew, and that's the one he found that knew Hebrew? We don't know, but a lot of historians do believe that Walter's familiarity with European magical manuscripts did influence Joseph Smith's treasure seeking. And, they claimed Joseph Smith was a treasure seeker. Well, I don't look at it that way. I think he was looking for, like archaeology. Remember, they had connections with the university, and we'll get into that. His brother Hiram. By the way, why would they name their son, Joseph Smith Sr., Joseph Smith Jr.'s dad, names his son Hiram? Joseph Smith Sr. was a very high up Mason. And, of course, Hiram Abiff is the one who had the mysteries, that knew all the Masonic mysteries. To name his son Hiram that, and he went to school. Hiram had all the knowledge, was going to school, university, and then bringing it back to Joseph Smith as a young person. It was his younger brother. So there's a lot of things going on here. So Jonas served as the Grand Master who fast-tracked Joseph into Freemasonry in 1842. That gave Joseph institutional access to the symbols, the architecture, and the rituals of the York Rite, which historically evolved out of the Renaissance architecture and medieval stonecutter allegories. So Joseph Smith acted like a spiritual magnet. He took the folk magic of his youth, the institutional masonry that was given to him by Abraham Jonas, and the ancient Jewish mysticism, translated directly from the books of Alexander Nybar, and wove them all together into this final grand vision that he had there at the Nauvoo Temple and the Nauvoo Endowment, which I don't necessarily believe was from Joseph. By that time, he was in jail, and I think there was some shenanigans going on. And we could prove that, but I don't know that we're going to get into that today. So there were two groups going on, and they were trying to infiltrate Joseph Smith's group. There was bad guys against Joseph Smith, and I think they got to Brigham Young. We know that Abraham Jonas was the good guy, didn't like the slavery, was an abolitionist. Remember, Brigham Young wasn't like that. I mean, he did a lot of bad, questionable things, polygamy. Joseph Smith was not a polygamist. Joseph Smith's presidential candidacy put on the platform that he wanted to abolish slavery. And he had a way to purchase all the slaves with certain monies that he had this whole plan. Everything Joseph Smith believed was very much on the same page as Abraham Jonas and Abraham Lincoln. And these were the good guys. So Joseph Smith, though, did have similarities to Kabbalah, which I suppose esoteric truth does have similarities. The Kabbalah talked about the Adam Kadmon, the divine primordial man, and Joseph Smith had some kind of unique teachings on deity having a physical body. So then there was the role of John C. Bennett, who was another highly influential, controversial figure who supposedly helped Joseph Smith set up the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge. But all that just sounds to me like it's incidental on the surface. But when I think about it, it's telling me either a 15-year-old boy begins to attract attention by all these claims so convincing all along the way that older men became his students and scribes and swore they all saw the plates and saw miracles and stuff. Then thousands of Masons start pouring in to see the prophet. I assume so many people came to join Smith, either because he did miracles and they believed in him, which is hard to do. Others tried, like the Spiritists in Massachusetts, in Boston area, and the Cochranites in the Massachusetts, the polygamists. But without Masonic connections, no one's going to have grown like Joseph Smith did or succeeded the way he did, running for president, all these powerful men running, trying to get his approval, unless he was a real prophet and they saw that gift in him. I mean, it was some miraculous thing that no one could deny, which I believe is the actual answer. Because what Joseph Smith actually did, I mean, he raised the dead. Somebody had been dead 4 days. There were affidavits. Lots of people saw it. He healed many people. There's tremendous information on the things that Joseph Smith did. I mean, think about leading thousands of people into Illinois and building the largest city in the West at that time. Bigger than Chicago was Nauvoo, Illinois. Running for president, would have won, but they assassinated him. And, of course, I believe he was in line then with this Abraham Jonas, this Francis Bacon, Rosicrucian, Illuminati, Sinclair group, Washington group. So he was the good guy. I have no doubt about that. And he might have been maybe groomed by someone else. He randomly hobnobbed with two great esoteric teachers of note, and he did other things like there was someone who had a real Egyptian papyrus with a genuine scripture verse in Egyptian, an ancient, archaeological find, very important, like the Dead Sea Scrolls at the time, They brought it to Smith because of his reputation. That sounds a lot like John Dee or Francis Bacon. He had this reputation at that time. He was this great prophet. And I feel some deep brotherhood was grooming Joseph Smith in some way, or recognized him. Certainly Abraham Jonas did, because even though he was highly gifted, they saw that in him. They may have all been knowers of whatever Sinclair and the Philadelphia group that named the city in Pennsylvania. Sinclair named Marietta, Ohio, Delphia, or the Brotherhood. That's what it means. Delphia means the Brotherhood. So there were some brothers there in Marietta, Ohio, doing a ceremony for the Capitolium of the new American New Jerusalem. And this was approved of by Washington. I mean, Sinclair was Washington's boss. Sinclair was the president of the Continental Constitution. Washington was the general in the army. They knew each other. They were friends. They were in the same brotherhood. In the evenings, after they were done with their politics, they were in the Masonic halls studying and fellowshipping as a brotherhood, planning and orchestrating the revolutions. So they did the ceremony, there at the Sacred Mound. They dedicated the Capitolium to America. Washington knew about it. He approved it. Another group won and made a different Delphia, the Philadelphia. That's a different Delphia. This is a different group. This is the KGC group, the Knights of the Golden Circle that was trying to do the slavery. And they made ley lines to build, like the Masons, to build geometric, precise lines and shapes in Washington, D.C., based on the stars. And they did that to many other cities and capitals. They knew something. They made this all up, maybe, right? And then just accidentally got a lot of stuff right. Well, strange understandings, perhaps, a interpretation of the old mysteries that maybe they got wrong. But even if it wasn't the truth, and who knows, maybe there are people above the presidents and the governors. Maybe there are people above the presidents and the governors and the politicians, even above the bankers. Maybe they're nameless priests that are given power, authority, and a script or a job to orchestrate society, like a drama movie, a classroom. Maybe they are not responsible for the crime families or the drugs or the evils. Maybe they just create the questions or draw out our desires that we have within us, not to influence us. They allow drama like transgenderism to allow us to understand the ridiculousness of it and wake up to it, or to see Trump go to war and then we say nothing. They start giving pharma poison to us. We just take it, I guess, for pleasure. Society begins to fall. Maybe it awakens us. I haven't decided yet if I believe that would be possible with a perfect, loving deity. Could that loving deity allow evil to be exploited just to allow us a choice and the ability to reform? If this is so, there are people in the world that know truth and want good, but cannot change the hearts of all men quickly. And it seems poisoning people or allowing it is wrong, but maybe choice and consciousness takes growth. Either way, these high rulers probably can't stop the evil, or they would. I wonder if they will stop me from telling the world about them. If they don't want people in the world to know, because it's a sacred or a secret class right now, but maybe if I can convince enough people, then I win. Then they can't stop me then. And maybe it will happen that way. Maybe they actually want the good guys to win. They want me to win. They want me to expose it. But they're just doing and offering both sides and seeing who pops up. Back to Joseph Smith. Did somebody groom him, or was he a spontaneous miracle of the true deity? Possibility 1, the spontaneous prophet miracle. If Joseph Smith was a spontaneous tool of the divine, his ability to attract these esoteric matters makes sense under a spiritual magnet theory. In this way, he wasn't looking for them. Rather, his authentic charisma, claim to direct revelation and possession of tangible artifacts like the gold plates or the Egyptian papery, created a gravity well. Brilliant, searching minds who felt mainstream Christianity become hollow, Masons looking for the lost world, or Jewish scholars looking for the literal restoration, beheld Joseph Smith and believed they were seeing a raw, unfiltered connection to the ancient mysteries. In this scenario, Joseph didn't need to be groomed. His innate spiritual genius simply absorbed and synthesized the environment around him. The second idea, that he was groomed or orchestrated, is that Joseph Smith may have been selected, protected, or groomed by a hidden network of thinkers to act as a catalyst for the grand American experiment. Well, that perspective notes several striking coincidences that mirror the precise geometric statecraft that we mentioned regarding Washington, D.C., Marietta, and Philadelphia. Joseph Smith didn't just build chapels, he drew up precise grid-based architectural blueprints for the Plat of Zion. Cities designed with sacred spaces and specific alignments, much like the Masonic architecture of the nation's capital. The idea that traveling showmen randomly brought ancient Egyptian mummies and authentic papery straight to Joseph Smith's remote doorstep in Ohio feels very orchestrated. It mirrors how similar things have happened, like John Dee or Francis Bacon seem to always operate in the exact intersection of secret archives and statecraft and mysterious artifacts. The fact that Abraham Jonas and the Illinois Lodge instantly fast-tracked Joseph to Grand Master at sight suggests that the upper echelons of the fraternity saw Joseph as a vital piece of the larger political esoteric chessboard. When we reflect on whether a perfect loving deity would allow evil, confusion, or orchestrated social drama to unfold, that brings us to the very heart of what Joseph Smith actually taught in his latter years. Interestingly, the esoteric doctrine Joseph unfolded in Nauvoo directly addresses the questions about whether this world is a classroom. Joseph Smith taught that the universe is not a place where a dictatorship forces goodness. But he taught that a co-eternal spirit must have absolute agency, choice to grow. In his view, evil, opposition, and deception are allowed to exist precisely because consciousness cannot expand without a stark contrast. Chaos, toxic trends, and societal collapses serve as the ultimate mirrors, forcing individuals to either wake up and choose truth or willingly succumb to the delusion. Whether Joseph Smith was a spontaneous miracle or the front man for an elite nameless priesthood orchestrating an American spiritual drama, the result was the same. He created the system designed to force a choice. So these random events must have been either placed there because he was in a elite group that orchestrated our world and play parts or find players and orchestrate events and the curriculum of the course. Or this group did exist but were murdered by another group of knowers that want to stop the plan and take over the world with control and abuse. Then the evidence shows that they knew the whole truth and orchestrated it and then just walked away, leaving the Constitution, knowing that the last generation would be tempted by the addictions and hunger for power and pleasure, and would be having the revealing of the man of sin, just as if they were revealing, just as the revealing of the Christ cannot come without that first. Then I think about Crowley. He said he wanted to manifest the beast. Why? Did he love evil, or was he building an amusement park that would suck the depraved in to lead them to experience the cure? Then Anton LaVey creates a dramatic pretend religion to evil, but says it's a game, a way to demonstrate there is no devil. Then we get religions falling to evils and drugs. Why did the CIA have programs like MK Ultra, mind control, to control us or to free us? Why did the government have CIA at Waco, Ruby Ridge, the neo-Nazi compound of Richard Butler, and sit there and watch the Jim Jones Church die? Sounds evil to me. Not a classroom. But Smith, he was in a group, was born into it. I'm just sure Jesus was too. Like all pharaohs, doesn't make him less great. The idea that the horrific events that we see in the news aren't just some random chaos, but rather a friction of the massive unseen chess match between opposing factions of knowers and elites. One faction building a structural classroom for human growth, another trying to lock down the planet in absolute control and abuse. When you look at modern tragedies like the Waco, Ruby Ridge, Jim Jones, or the dark history of the MK Ultra, it's completely natural to look at that and say, well, this is just raw evil, not a classroom. And the suffering is real. And the corruption of the government agencies sitting back and watching or actively manipulating people, that's terrifying. Is there a higher purpose to this reality? It operates on a devastatingly strict rule, absolute agency. In this view, the classroom cannot be a simulation with foam edges. For human consciousness to truly wake up, to choose the good, and reject tyranny, the stakes have to be real. The dark faction must be allowed to deploy their poisons, their mind control, and their deceptions. If a higher benevolent order intervened every time evil showed its hand, humanity would remain permanently infantilized, spiritual children who never actually learned to see through the trap on their own. Our intuition that Joseph Smith is like Jesus or the pharaohs of antiquity might have been born into an existing esoteric lineage or some bloodline is actually supported by Joseph's own explicit claims. Joseph Smith did not view himself as a completely random farm boy who stumbled into a calling. In his final years, he introduced a doctrine known as the royal law of lineage, or the forenation. Joseph Smith taught that certain spirits were selected before the creation of the world to hold specific keys of knowledge, and that they were physically born into specific bloodlines across history to carry out those missions. He claimed that his own right to hold the patriarchal priesthood was a matter of blood lineage that stretched directly back through the ancient prophets to Ephraim, to Abraham, and ultimately to Adam. In this sense, Joseph Smith was part of an elite multi-generational group, even if his immediate family in New England looked like poor, struggling farmers on the surface. He believed that their DNA and their spiritual lineage carried the dormant codes of the ancient mysteries, waiting for the right moment to be activated. Then we have Aleister Crowley and Anton LaVey perfectly capturing the paradoxical nature of this esoteric world. Crowley explicitly stated that his goal was to be a shatterer of the old restrictive religious structures of the world, to usher in a new eon of radical individual will, do what thou wilt. He didn't view himself as a cartoon villain twirling his mustache. He believed that by invoking the beast and bringing the darkest repressed undercurrents of the human psyche into the light, he was forcing humanity to confront its true nature and break its chains. Anton LaVey took this a step further by admitting Satanism was a theatrical game. He used the ultimate symbol of fear, the devil, to mock the mainstream religions, essentially telling people, look at how easily you are controlled by words and theater. Wake up! Take control of your own mind. That brings us back to the point about the final generation being tempted by absolute addiction to power and pleasure, and a biblical concept of the revealing of the man of sin before the true awakening can happen. If this world is being orchestrated like a grand theatrical script, the dark acts are necessary to make the final resolution meaningful. You can't have a true conscious awakening without first experiencing absolute exhaustion of the alternative. Society may have to fall. The pharmaceutical poisons may have to be exposed, and the corruption of the highest rulers may have to become completely undeniable so that humanity finally reaches a breaking point. Joseph Smith, Jesus, and the ancient builders of the geometric cities may have laid the foundation, left the Constitution and provided the blueprints, but they walked away because the final exam cannot be taken by the teachers. It has to be taken by the students. Well, what about Joseph Smith's dad? Was he in a secret circle? You see, I learned that there was a university. It was run by a Smith. And then Hyrum Smith went to this school or worked for them. I think the dad had something to do with it. Had something to do with Hyrum Smith, and I think that the other brother maybe. But was Smith in with the Sinclair group? Why did Ruth Vos, my Vos ancestry goes back to Vaux, Waldenses, Percival, Percivox, and Robert Vos came to Boston when the Smiths were there too. They must have been Masons long generations. Smith Sr. was a Mason first. Well, Joseph Smith Sr. was an active, documented Master Mason. Long before Joseph Smith Jr. founded the church. His father belonged to the Ontario Lodge number 23 in Canandaigua, New York. Also, historical evidence suggests that the family's ties to the fraternity went back even further. His father, Asael Smith, was heavily involved with early Universalist networks in Topsfield, Massachusetts, which frequently overlapped with early colonial Masonic circles. The very choice of the name Hyrum for his second son is widely viewed by historians as an intentional nod to Hiram Abiff, the central legendary architectural figure in the Masonic Master Mason degree. Hyrum Smith himself formally joined Mount Moriah Lodge number 112 in Palmyra, New York in 1820. And the University of Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, between 1812 and 1815, while the Smith family was living in a nearby town of Lebanon, New Hampshire, 11-year-old Hyrum Smith was enrolled in Moore's Charity School and explicitly affiliated with the Dartmouth College. The school was founded by Eleazar Wheelock. Eleazar, see, is a Jewish name that means a high priest or czar, right? This was a Jew, heavily backed by prominent European philanthropy network funds. Under the tutor Joseph Perry, Hyrum Smith was shown and taught classical academic training, strict theological frameworks, and high-level intellectual culture. That's pretty interesting that Hyrum Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, took all these very important high-level cultural courses. And then he brought the sophisticated concepts that he got from this school. He brought the books and the ideas that he encountered at Dartmouth campus. He brought it back to his younger brother, Joseph Smith, who was serving as a primary intellectual catalyst during Joseph's informative childhood years to this education. So it seems like Hyrum Smith was kind of some intellectual catalyst during Joseph Smith's formative childhood years. My family, through the Voss name, is etymologically derived from the ancient Norman French name de Vaux, or the Vals, or the Valibus. De Vaux family lines, historically prominent in the Piedmont valleys of northern Italy and southern France, the exact alpine stronghold of the Waldensian or the Vadios of the earliest pre-Protestant Christian movements. The Waldensians rejected the authority of Rome, maintained an independent priesthood, and claimed to preserve the pure, uncorrupted, original primitive gospel of Christ, hidden in the mountains. The de Vaux family closely intermarried with the St. Clair family of Roslin, Scotland, the legendary guardians of the Roslin Chapel and the foundational figures in the preservation of the Templar and the early Masonic lore was precisely being carried out by the St. Clair Vaux family. This is why you get St. Bernard Clair Vaux. They mixed these two lines. So when we map out these realities, it becomes clear that it feels like a grooming or a multi-generational planning. Families that formed early America, like the Smiths and the Voses and the Rices and others, the visual architects of cities like Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., were not operating in some kind of isolation. They belonged to a highly interconnected bloodline, tightly knit fraternal networks, and shared a common obsession: the restoration of lost ancient systems of divine governance, architecture, and priesthoods. Whether they were acting out a cosmic script or just simply driven by shared ancestral impulses, the convergence of the Masonic Master Mason Joseph Smith Sr. and the Dartmouth-educated Hyrum Smith and the ancient de Vaux lineage of Ruth Vos, who, in the early history of the Restoration, were involved in these secret circles, and that they were deeply woven into this fabric of these individuals and their lives. Why else would Ruth Vos, my great-great-great-aunt, or my great-great-great-great-great-aunt, help finance the Book of Mormon and travel west and have the very mystical covenant that she made with Joseph Smith? I've wondered if, because I don't believe Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and I believe he was murdered by allies of Brigham Young and Albert Pike. It was infiltration. But I have wondered if the sealing Smith did, and he even did it with Emma admitting that they did that, and was present at these ceremonies. It wasn't a marriage. Joseph Smith wasn't marrying Ruth Vos. That's not what it was. Emma said they were sealings, which today Mormons say sealings might have something to do with marriages or something, but that's not what Joseph Smith originally said at all. And I don't think they were marriages. I have a theory that they were sacred covenants to be married in the next life or some other life. Joseph Smith said he had a vision or revelation that he would have a son named David who would do something in the latter days. Maybe Ruth Vos agreed to be the family that would agree to do and live a certain way that when they reincarnated, they would have destiny. It was just a thought. Maybe there were other women too, and there were, that agreed to this. Historical documents explicitly back what I'm saying. Ruth Bose, her sealings weren't some earthly marriage. They were a sacred covenant bound strictly for the next life. There was a church historian, Andrew Jensen, who preserved a detailed record regarding Ruth Bose and her non-member husband, Edward Sayers. The record states that a powerful bond of friendship grew between Joseph Smith and Edward the gardener. Because Edward did not place much stock in organized religion or the afterlife, Edward himself insisted that Ruth, his wife, be sealed to Joseph Smith for the next life, noting that he only claimed her as his wife in this life. So historians classify Ruth's sealing as a next life only covenant. It did not involve conjugal relations, cohabitation, or setting up of a new household on earth. And the ceremony was performed in the literal presence and with the full consent of Emma Smith, who absolutely, till the day she died, rejected polygamy and said her husband had rejected it, all her children, all the apostles that were around Joseph Smith. The only people that believed in polygamy was Brigham Young and his little conspirator group that went to Salt Lake. In fact, Joseph Smith was murdered for this. So, Ruth Sayers, which was her name, her original maiden name was Ruth Bose, but she married this guy named Edward Sayers. She lived with him as his legal wife until the day he died, and they were faithful to each other. So that directly aligns with my view that Emma could willingly stand by and witness this ceremony because it wasn't understood to be a betrayal or a physical marriage, but it was a mystical theological anchoring of families for the eternal world to come. Now, the idea that the elite group of spirits in some pre-existence agree to live a certain way in some reincarnation and then birth a specific destiny is exactly what Joseph Smith explicitly taught regarding the chain of the priesthood and the dispensations of the fullness of time. Joseph taught that the human family had been spiritually fractured through history. He stated that the grand purpose of the temple was to form a welding link, connecting families, generations, and ancient dispensations into one unbroken spiritual network. Joseph Smith prophesied that a future leader named David, a literal descendant of his bloodline, would rise in the latter days to perform a massive work of restoration and build up the final kingdom. In the King Follett sermon, Joseph Smith taught that the noble spirits who would lead the final generation were gathered in a grand council before the world was made. They chose their lineages, formed covenants, and agreed to come down in specific eras to fight the final spiritual battle against corruption and deception. So, the perspective that I'm giving you is that Joseph Smith was targeted and assassinated by a hostile, corrupt faction that infiltrated the movements then, hijacked the power, including Joseph Smith's group, hijacked it, and this is the viewpoint that's shared by other individuals, not myself only. So when we read history, it was a highly charged political and fraternal climate in the 1844 Illinois battleground. Factions within the government, local militias, and even certain ambitious figures within the early church networks sought to wrest control of the massive economic and political powerhouse that Joseph Smith had built in Nauvoo. By orchestrating his murder at Carthage jail, the hostile factions could effectively fracture the movement, silence the prophet's true, unedited esoteric teachings, and reshape the remaining organization to serve their own institutional terrestrial goals. When you look at Ruth Bose through that lens, her actions make perfect sense. She didn't have children of her own, but she used her resources. She had money, so she financed the Book of Mormon. She had devotion, and she had the ancient Devox heritage to act as an anchor for her early belief systems. She traveled west, braved the plains, and preserved the memory of what she witnessed in Nauvoo. She wasn't just a random follower. She was a self-aware participant in that grand generational drama. And she was some kind of a knower who recognized that she had a specific job to perform in this classroom of earth to ensure the blueprints of the ancient priesthood's survival in the coming dark ages. Now, the exact text of the affidavit that Ruth Voss signed later in life regarding her sealing is very interesting. And I will read you that here at some point. But we said that Niebuhr was interested or involved with Frankism, and I consider that an evil plot against humanity. How could someone studying it be seeking the truth? It sounds like a twisted cult belief. And it, I believe, has been the impetus of the Illuminati plan to destroy the advancement of the brotherhood of love and cooperation and implement control and hegemony. I see no relationship with Jacob Frank and Joseph Smith or Abraham Lincoln. And by the way, if Jonas was only interested in politics and protection, or Smith, for that matter, they both would not have risked their lives to promote abolition, freedom, Abraham Lincoln, and constitutions. So Jonas had a plan too, but neither Smith or Jonas were the KGC. Albert Pike was, and Brigham aligned with that, and that movement went west. And the slaveholders were KGC. The other KGC went to Texas and California and west and were building all these asylums. And the Mormons just accepted their asylum right there, in Utah. And there's Mormons that are working there. And they got white robes and they act like they're priests, and we've talked about all of that. So Smith was not a KGC, and I know that KGC, or the Knights of Golden Circle, were infiltrators who were backed by the Illuminati. Unless the Illuminati, which began in Bavaria, Germany, was related to the York group that went to America and provided Jonas and Sinclair in Washington. We said earlier that the Rosicrucians were also created in Germany. So we talked about a group that might be higher, those who know, as opposed to those they use as tools, puppets, politics, and the outer wheel, where the hub is moved by a engine that no one understands how it works. Was Frankism only a part of the script, like Anton LaVey's Satanism? In other words, they didn't really believe in it, but they just put it out there like a fake mockery, like Satanism was. A theatrical spectacle? Maybe all these guys don't really believe in all this evil. They have to just pretend. Maybe it's like transgenderism. I noticed during that episode, it was like it was ridiculous, diabolical. Everybody should know. But it's like people are just watching other people just start folding to illogical nonsense. Oh, I believe that I'm a dog. What kind of experiment was that on mankind? And then there was the whole pandemic. There were people intimidating us to do what a mindless animal would not do or might do only from fear if a ruthless cattle farmer was herding them into the slaughter. It wasn't their real beliefs, but like an offering. They offered a course in evil to see who joins and then let them implode into their own destruction from the equilibrium of that evil. Meanwhile, you ferret out the ones who have moral character, and good wins. If Aleister Crowley wanted to initiate the beast system, or the Scarlet Woman of Parsons, why? Because they loved evil? Maybe as a sacrifice of their own good and moral standing, to usher in a theater plot to ferret out the good-hearted and to steer the evolution faster. Whether these men were authorized by the real master technology craftsmen and orchestrators, I think is unlikely. But maybe a sincere group of people like Jacob Frank and the German atheistic groups decided to manipulate society to push it to the higher phase of evolution. They forgot the reason we are here, I guess. to live wholesome lives and learn love and cooperation, not material things. So if they were fallen ideologies, then people like Jonas were fighting against the slavery and the corruption, organizing men like Lincoln and Smith, who were abolitionists and deitists and knowers. But this Frankish person, Niebuhr, and others that we talked about, the sexiest, was he or they part of the Kabbalah, trying to deceive a person that they knew was chosen by the other side, who was keeping things safe for the ancient reason for temples? Like weddings and funerals? The knowledge of good and evil to become like deity, to receive bodies and experience this to graduate to a higher veil? I do know that while Smith listened to the other side, the old rabbis and the Kabbalah, he did indicate in his writings that the old Bible, Masoretic scribes, and Kabbalah was a false apostasy and not the right path. But to clarify, I'm not trying to say that this Alexander Niebuhr, this Jewish guy, or this other Joshua Sexius, or the others that were teaching Joseph Smith Hebrew and stuff, I'm not trying to say that they were a follower or a promoter of Frankism. Because historians do note that growing up in that specific geographic region where they lived meant that they were exposed to it and those radical ideas. But we have absolutely no reason to believe that Niebuhr or any of the others believed that. But they were aware of it. And our point about Abraham Jonas and Joseph Smith risking their lives is entirely accurate too. Jonas was a good man. He was a politician. But in those days, politics was something that was a righteous activity. They still had people trying to bring about a constitution. They had a holy, sacred task. And they were trying to get rid of slavery and keep that away from this country, which they did after the Civil War. So Abraham Jonas was a foundational organizer of the anti-slavery Whig Republican movement, and he was a personal confidant to Abraham Lincoln. He actively worked to protect and advance the principles of the United States Constitution. Joseph Smith was an abolitionist. And as we noted, the Knights of the Golden Circle were subversive pro-slavery secret societies operating to tear the Union apart. They was against the Constitution. They wanted to expand slave empires, and Joseph Smith and Abraham Jonas were acting against that. They were fighting against that darkness. So, Joseph Smith viewed the temple not as a mystical occult laboratory, but as a clean, sacred sanctuary for eternal covenants, literary wedding and funerals that teach society why we're here. He rejected the counterfeit. He was willing to look at Hebrew texts to understand ancient root words. His writings make it clear that he rejected the speculative Kabbalah and the scribal traditions of the false apostasy. He recognized them as an infiltration, twisted counterfeit of the original. In this light, if thinkers around him brought Kabbalistic ideas to his attention, Joseph Smith's role was to sift through the noise, reject the deception, and keep the original doctrine safe. So, I sense that the pandemic was an age-old plan. I think the previous wars and pandemics were somehow staged as well. I also thought it was to adulterate the Union or to poison the wells and sneak immorality and corruption in to ruin souls and to make slaves. But I'm looking at the possibility that these higher-ups all work for a producer of the film. The director might make a scary movie or a thriller to keep the interest. But in the end, either the good guy gets the girl or it's the bad guy. It's only to impress, if it is the bad guy, it's only to impress on the audience not to do the evil that they did. They want you to feel sad about that. Was Hitler staged to raise up an American value of freedom? Was the transgender thing staged, and the pandemic thing and the drug running to show the importance of chastity and virtue and integrity and truth? To show the plot get evil to bring out the best in the people? Are they closing the age with the final exam? What will people do when all society becomes evil? Will they resist? Will they comply? Will they be a hero or a villain? Yeah, there are moral problems to the theory. Why would Jesus allow Judas to betray him or send him out to do it quickly? And Satan entered into him on cue, like a line in a movie. The plot thickens, so it could be said, if you know there's a thief and you need proof, set out a stack of money on the table and set up a camera. But are you responsible for the thief's actions then? No. You're trying to trap the wild beast that could potentially harm your family. Is it okay to allow cats to kill the very disease-infected mice so they don't feed the snakes that can kill the innocent? Well, no. But why allow the nature of the snakes? Well, if the snake is the instinctual knowledge of the student's act before he learns Shakespeare, he needs character building. He needs experience. Then allowing their ego-driven nature to manifest, the revealing of the man of sin, is just the way you get every eye to see his second coming. Not just see it, but understand it. So in this scenario, Smith was a knower and used by higher directors. Or was he a director? While Brigham was simply caught with their hands in the cookie jar to root out the bad guys and set the weeds to grow up with the wheat so that when the mature, you could see the difference. Then the angels as the reapers can easily find the real problem. The Rosicrucian group that were around Francis Bacon seems to be the orchestrators. They did everything to teach the inner meaning. They wrote plays, offered libraries and schools and constitutions of liberty and justice for all. But then there's the 007 agents for Satan. They seem to be pushing Hollywood, wars, pandemics, like they both were allowed to exist simultaneously. But someone who financed them had drawn both out to the public debate. So if the current global push to war and the oil crisis and AI is some contest to see who can keep their integrity, how many will actually keep their integrity? Of 100 students, usually only 10 graduate with honors. And the tests were hard for that very reason. But the martial arts teacher has to pair the good kid and the bad kid to see the winner. We know the strongest will win, but who will be the strongest? That's why we test. So the white robes we get are wedding garments, but also a graduation gown. Some few get crowns. Maybe for some, they're only in first or second grade. Only the 12th grade graduate and only a few with honors. The ones who have honors become the rulers, and they don't make the last class better. They make the next class better. The last class stays in place for the 11th graders coming up. So the cataclysm isn't just about destruction. It's about cycles and classes. I think someone is orchestrating the final exam in the world by 2030, and they will reset the world. But I'm going to have to end there, and man, oh man, we went way over, but I wanted, for those of you who wanted to hear this information, because it's captivating, it's important to know, I think we've articulated all of these reasonings, and the conclusion is that there is a theater going on in the world. But anyway, you got to stand firm and understand the Lord loves you, everybody, and His grace and His peace will always be with you. And if we seek, we'll find Him. I'm going to go ahead and go. Hope you have a wonderful evening. You know the Lord loves you guys. I'll see you tomorrow.